Apparently it does. Okay, I guess we're live. Oh, I hate YouTube so much. YouTube, I hate you so much for what you do. It didn't tell me that I was going live. It just changes everything around, so all of a sudden it went auto live without asking me. Let's see, pop out chat. I was going to do my green screen thing, and I'm not sure if I'm going to do that. And I did manage to change the title. That's another thing it wasn't letting me do last time. Set that to live chat and go back to OBS. That was also not behaving. Hey, Andy. Voila. All right. Hey, well, I'm here. Technology's been kicking my ass lately. I have released a plugin, Bright Ambience 2, and I'm doing my live stream. Hopefully won't get dragged away from it to deal with anything else, but if I am, so be it. I am moving slowly here because I got a cup of nice coffee, which is too hot for me to drink. But, and I'm not feeling super well, and blah, blah, blah. But, Dad says maybe. Here we are. Plus, anything might happen. That is more true than ever, seeing as the anything that might happen can also equal trying to set this whole thing up and having my switcher refuse to work, which is what happened the very first thing, which is why, actually, no, come to think of it, YouTube changed my whole system around so that I can no longer do the set something up and specify what it is and then go live. Instead, it just kind of makes me go live anyway. And all of the controls are different and wrong and broken and changed and removed. So I am one happy camper today, I'll tell you. But I'm pretty happy about the Bright Ambience thing anyway. And that is what I changed the title of the thing to, although I'm not sure whether it went live that way. If anybody sees the title of this live stream, tell me whether it says Airwindows Q&A Sonic Spaces or whether it still says Space House 811. Last week I did the second music jam, and it retained the same name from the first one, which was dated, so it had the wrong name on it. I guess YouTube just messes with me ruthlessly and relentlessly. This is one of the reasons why I keep my coding on a laptop, or now laptops, in a virtual machine that is forced never to change, because stuff changes out from under me and then I can't cope with it. So here's the thing. Life is still strange and full of change and unpredictability. And if I work at it, I can be one of the forces of predictability. So even though it is fighting me with everything that it has, I am here nevertheless. And I have a pen to write with, and I have some note cards in case we get good ideas for future plugins and stuff. I've got a stack of these filled out, by the way, that I'm gradually working through. And I'm talking about the next burst of plugins that will happen. And some things, oh good. And I did spell it correctly, so also good. Let me drag my microphone over to where I will be. And even though, see, this is an autism thing, I'm telling you. I'm convinced this is an autism thing, although to some extent it is also a human thing. That when I try to get set to do something in a way that I'm familiar, and then all manner of stuff is changed out from under me, I'm really knocked for a loop. I feel more than your typical human would be, and can't focus or do damn near anything, because some part of me is still like, but I can't start because I need to do the YouTube thing where I click go live on YouTube and it opens up this little window, and this window has the things that I set, and I need to type this into that and that into this and tell it that I'm going to go live at 11, so I need to show up a little bit earlier, otherwise it will start going ahead in 5-minute increments. And I've done that over and over, so I'm fixed to do it, and then YouTube changes everything, and suddenly it never shows me that thing again. And I'm just, I can't cope. So this is me getting off to a slower start, although granted it's 11:08. This is not that much of a slower start. And since my job in Q&A sessions is to answer questions, but also keep up running dialogue for an hour and, an hour and 46 minutes or so at this point. That is tied to how the Patreon is doing. So if the Patreon dissipates, I get to spend less time doing it. But if the Patreon increases, I spend more time. In fact, the music stream also goes that long. And that's been interesting too, because it's like a lot of work went into being able to fire that buck up, and I'm glad that you liked it, because that was exactly what the intention was. I'm even working on some new details here. Let me show you a thing that I made. I could have made this as a Instagram post, and maybe I still will. Yeah, I hate the new Creator Studio. It's bad. Here's something that I built. I plug it into the video thing because the first time I played, I didn't have any interaction with the video thing at all. I just kind of let it do what it natively did, which turns out to be just one mode out of about 50. And the second time I had learned how to do the video thing, but it did not have patches that could tie it into stuff that was happening in the music very well. So I built these. This is a little jack, or plug rather, of the kind that I buy by the 100 from Mouser Electronics. You're supposed to injection mold plastic around this and build it into some kind of really cheap patch cord. What I've done is soldered a potentiometer to it, and these are the potentiometers that I got literally thousands of in hopes that I can do that getting technology into the hands of people thing. So I'm using one for this. I suppose if they're all broken, I'll have a nasty surprise, but so far it doesn't look as if they are. And I've got this cable wired to it, so I can adjust how much energy gets through to this jack, this plug. And this is an alligator clip. I bought these as just sort of alligator clips that clip to some kind of Ethernet cable or something. What I do is I have a bunch of wiring on the synthesizer that is just bare wires and cable ends made out of these. There's like more than 80 individual connections of this alone, not counting all the spaghetti wires that you also see. And what I'll do is take the alligator clip and clamp it onto the end of one of these cables so that I can have an extra little jumper. Although technically if I do that, that is going to pull down the resistance, so I might need to I've made 4 of these, maybe I need to redo all of them now, or just cut some of the connections, I'm not even sure. But point being, this is for being able to take an output of some kind and run it to the visualizer so that I can have stuff going to some kind of clip like this. Or like that. You can't see that because it's hiding behind the chat. Oh well. So I'm building that stuff, and I put a lot of time into that, which is why the whole music stream thing seemed different last time I did it. And we'll just see where that goes, because I'd gone more than a month without doing anything. I needed to revise it into a space where I knew what I was doing with it, and I wanted to do that thing, so it didn't matter whether anybody was there, whether anybody appreciated what it was or not, because it is sort of a side thing anyway. It's where I get inspiration for a lot of this stuff, but it's not meant to be the guts of the channel or what I do, really. It's just, you want to invent something, you want to do something new. So let me have a look at the chat and see where this is. M is asking, is a biquad shelf filter even possible, or a tilt? Well, I've got stuff along those lines. Like, I don't remember what the name of the tilt one actually was. If I drank about 5 more cups of coffee, I'd remember. But in theory, I left out the biquad shelf stuff simply because I do that sort of thing with dry wet controls and things. It is, of course, possible. It's a additional feature in how to run biquad things, and I just happened to not incorporate that in the design. Yeah, tone slant sounds about right, yeah. So that's the answer, is a biquad shelf is indeed possible, and it would ask for extra controls and be a little more complicated to implement. So when I did biquads, and I have notions like I would like to revisit the biquad so that I can have a filter kind of like biquad and biquad 2 and biquad 1/2. I'm looking to do a biquad double, which is simply 2 instances of the biquad in sequence for when you want to use a non-resonant filter but have a steeper cutoff, something like that. That's one of the things that's going to end up happening. I am scaring people off right and left. I guess that's just because this has been a grueling few months, and that's fine. That's how it's going to be. What's the mechanics behind a tilt shelf? Well, bear in mind that the slope is usually a factor of resonance. One of the ways that I do tilt-like things is the biquads that I made, especially if you're looking for slow tilts, like not high resonance, then biquad 1/2 would be pretty relevant, because that is a interleaved filter. And granted, those are a little unusual, but that means you'll have half the slope that you would otherwise have. And using the biquad in such a way that I programmed it so that it was being calculated on very high resolution numbers. And this lets me do things that normal biquads can't, such as use insanely low resonance values, because it would start getting normally coded biquads are generally just running on 32-bit floats and stuff like that. And there is known to be issues where if you start pushing the settings too crazy, they literally refuse to work. Like, you can have biquads break because you've set the settings too extremely. And that's because the 32-bit floating point is not enough to keep track of the values that are required. So I basically was like, fine, it'll all be long doubles. Are you happy? And turns out the biquads are more happy when you do that. And you can set more extreme settings. And one of them, I believe, this is one of the things that breaks on normal biquads, is going to pathologically small amounts of resonance. And that means that you can get effectively a tilt filter. You just have to know how you're setting it. Like if you're doing a bass boost tilt, that becomes a treble roll-off. And you just set the frequency really, really low and then have the resonance absurdly low. And one of the interesting things that happens with that, or indeed if you're doing a bandpass and setting the resonance to absurdly low, is it starts letting through almost everything, but it'll still block DC and it'll still block the Nyquist frequency. So that's interesting. And if I was going after a tilt filter, not counting like the tilt shift thing that I had, tone slant, if I was going for a tilt filter, that type of thing, I might try to do it using a biquad and just have the resonance set pathologically low. Because you can almost get... Maybe I should try to do the green screen. Want me to try to do the green screen and draw this on the screen? I'm not sure if I'm up to it today. We'll see. I was going to draw the chart for what the roll-off would look like on this. I'm also looking down here at a sort of shopping list, which is piles and piles of stuff that will also be happening this week. Like just this morning, I received a rented dumpster, and I need to clean out some of my place and clear out stuff. For instance, more residue from when my porch got run over by a car, and I've still got some of the damages from that and need to continue throwing it away. And yeah, piles of things to process through. Sometimes how it is. Speaking in terms of the sonic spaces, because I did mention that, I put that in the title of this live stream, and I can try to communicate that even if I don't have graphics, and this is mostly for writing down ideas if any of them arrive. The purpose of Bright Ambience 2 is interesting. People were asking for like, oh yeah, can you have any presets? And that's not how I work. We don't talk about presets because that's usually not relevant, but instead you have to be able to comprehend what is the way that processing is happening and what happens when you use it. Like, what is the purpose of this? What kinds of things are you trying to make? Maybe I should make that green screen. Hang on a second. I'll start moving stuff around. We'll see whether we can get this together. I do have a quick question. M was asking me, having the real lows quieter than mid lows, why can you suddenly hear the real lows better when they're much quieter? You may be producing artifacts from whatever filtering that you're using, and that is sometimes a thing. Like some of the low-cut filters that I've got emphasize near the cutoff frequency in such a way that they wind up putting out larger peaks than the original low frequency was. So you might have something like that going on. And Bo is asking, have I experimented with Haas delay? Kind of. I think it was an old plugin that I had once called Ambience that did that. Now, while I'm fooling with this, let me see. Oh, didn't mean to do that. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to do this. So that looks weird. I am now streaming craziness. Don't mind me, I'm trying to do a thing. I will find out whether it worked momentarily. Let's see whether that showed something. This is an inconvenient situation, but by God, it seems to have worked. A little crude, but seems to have worked. I think I also screwed up everything. No, that camera still seems to be right. So yeah, here's the deal. When you are talking about, and I wonder whether maybe I can resize this. Yeah, let's. When you are talking about doing visuals, no, this is what I'm doing visuals. When you're talking about doing sonic spaces, reverberation, you've got, say, a initial sound and time extends as far. Speaking of extending, I have to go and peek and see whether or not that's actually even on the screen that I want. And guess what? Looks like I will not be able to tell that, will I? Never mind then. So here, if you've got, let me do another layer. There we go. So now I can draw this and then remove that. So here is how reverberation works. Is you've got your initial sound. Don't mind me setting my brush size a little bit bigger if I can. Hard to tell whether I can or not. Oh, this is being cumbersome and awkward. Let's try that again. Why do thing not work when I need thing to work? Alrighty. So you see the line that is time and the initial impact. What reverberation is it's like echoes. So you can have an echo and another echo and so on. That can be what reverberation is like. So what bright ambience is doing is you could have it make just a single echo. I should probably tilt this so that I'm not drawing crooked. How about this? That's better. You can have a single echo that is exactly as loud as the previous one. And then if you increase it, you start getting a different effect, which is two closely spaced echoes that are near each other. And that would be if you had the initial delay this far off and then a very short decay. It's going to take these echoes and the output is going to be combined by how many of the echoes there are. So if you started, say, here and did a whole bunch of them, these are spaced with regard to prime numbers. So they're not even, they're not going to reinforce particular frequencies, and there will be little gaps in there from time to time. And it will go to whatever the end space is, as if it is a little rectangle. And that's what bright ambience looks like. Now, the interesting thing about that is that a actual reverb space, if your nearest wall is like here, it's going to start like that and die away. That's what a normal acoustic space sounds like. And all of the reverbs I've been doing lately in Airwindows are more than a little different than that. For instance, MV, which I'm very fan of as far as it being sort of a bloom effect that's kind of like the old MIDI verb. It's using only multiplications of exactly 0.5, so the reverb tail has a special purity because the mantissa of the samples is never changed. It's always left exactly the same, and only the exponent is changed. It can only go up and down by 6 dB increments. And the result of a bloom effect is kind of like this. And that it'll build up to a sound. It might even be a neater arrangement. Like your bloom envelope might be kind of like that. And then bright ambience, if you have a very sharp, small window, it's going to be kind of louder. I'm not very good as an artist, so all of my lines are all crooked and weird. That's going to be a narrow little rectangular window. And then if you have a larger space, if you start immediately, you're going to get whatever that is. So as time goes on, you'll have the reverb effect happening, and then it will basically abruptly stop. And that is an unnatural behavior. The regeneration has a tendency to try to kind of go like this. It's really still abruptly stopping. It's just that it's smoothing it a little bit out. And then if you have the quick echo and it's a narrower little window, what you're going to get is kind of more like this, because every time the echo comes through, it's going through that bright ambience processing again. So it's going to take the initial sound, spread it out into this little rectangular window, send that through the processing again. Since it's prime numbers, it kind of develops artifacts, but it resists it. If there were mathematical relations between the arrangements of the delay taps, you'd get really strong reinforcements. But regardless, it will spread it out a little bit further, and then as you go through that again, it'll spread it out even further, and that's the shape that is happening with this delay behavior that we've got. So one of the things that I'm speculating, and once I'm finished with that, I'm going to take away this green screen thing because it's fun and I really wanted to play with it a little bit, but I can't see chat because my system, even with YouTube messing with me and changing things out from under me, my system is still too much in flux, so I'm not really familiar with it, and every time I try some new thing, something else breaks or goes wrong. And so now I can't see chat while I'm demonstrating this stuff. It's fun, but I miss chat, so I need to see you guys again in a minute. Here's the thing. With doing reverb, you don't always want the natural acoustic sustain, because if you have a powerful reverb sound, this extended tail is going to blur together everything that's been happening in the last like 10 seconds or so. you'd want something a little bit shorter, which is why MV, with its unusual shape, which also cuts off after it's finished. Unless you're regenerating NV, which I don't think it has that capacity, I forget. It's not going to do a series of, actually, come to think of it, if MV was doing that, if MV did this and then had regeneration, what you would get would be increasingly spread out and slowed down, because as you have the initial sample, and then say it's centered on an initial sample in the middle here, it's spreading out sound as it goes with this onset and this decay, so that basically using regeneration on something that makes the delay taps more complicated starts making them more and more complicated in an infinite kind of way. Just geometric progression, it just expands outwards. And remember, we don't necessarily want this kind of shape in reverb. Granted, when you do your drums and a gated reverb, which is like, it's neat, it's very 80s, it's very characteristic, it's not necessarily what you want. That's typically being used in a super obvious way. But if you have a full mix and then you want there to be the impression of deep background echoes, that is where something like MV comes in, because it's not interfering with stuff in this immediate place. It's like having a pre-delay. You have your initial sound, and then if you have the initial sound and immediately delay or reverb, the reverb kind of melds with the sound and it makes it really difficult to hear, and it's not even particularly natural, because if you're in the middle of some kind of hall, and the hall's going to do that, your first echo might be here. Like, you make the sound, and then the first wall echo comes here, at which point you're starting to hear more. And it's probably going to act like first a couple of echoes, and then they get more complicated because they regenerate. Like this bounces over to here, bounces over to here. It's forming this comb filtery kind of effect because it's the same delay time every time. And that's one of the reasons that Bright Ambience 2 is interesting and different, is because the echoes inside Bright Ambience 2 are never the same time over and over again. You could never produce the comb filtering from having exactly the same delay tap over and over again. So here's the thing, and let me go and glance back at chat. If I can figure out how to make that work, I bet I can try. There we go. So while I'm looking at this goofiness, here is, I can see chat, even if you can't. Here, let me put this back. So I've got about a page of chat to look at. Which Airwindows reverb would be the most appropriate for a melodic sound with fast runs? I'll tell you that using the pictures. And yeah, the bright ambience for low mid-rangey sounds, interesting idea. I see that my OBS is now flickering and doing weird things. So let me go back to green screen world. And I'm assuming this is showing up, but I don't have any monitor screen to tell me whether any of this is actually working, so we'll see. Fast melodic runs probably means you want to have a pre-delay. You want to have whatever reverb happen in such a way that your fast melodic runs, like are happening before the echo of them starts happening over and over again in the reverb tail, because that's just going to distract from the sound. It adds fullness and like richness and depth, but it does distract from the sound. It makes it harder to hear the details of what's actually happening. Like if you are starting with that and you've got your little melodic thing, and then you've got an immediate reverb, so it's continually being filled with the echoes and convolutions of what was happening previously, you're covering up your initial sound. So this is why we use pre-delay on reverbs. We put pre-delay in there specifically to clear out. And if you want to be realistic, which doesn't necessarily matter, you also want to bear in mind the fact that the first echo is your floor. Even if the walls and ceiling are much farther away from you, you're probably not floating in the middle of space. So your first echo is probably the floor, and the first echo is going to be fairly close. And then maybe the next walls are going to be like that, which means that the floor echo is also going to bounce off of the ceiling and whatever, so it's going to show up there, and the ceiling echo, and so on. And you're going to get this kind of behavior where things get increasingly more complicated towards the reverb tail. But what if you were doing something kind of different? And this is what I'm going to be exploring in future. Like, expect a sort of unholy hybrid of MV and Bright Ambience 2. I'll be working on something to that effect. I'd like to come up with some kind of really cool reverb that is as good or better than my MIDI verb stuff, and figure out a way of doing that. But the guts of the idea here are, you want a pre-delay before your reverb. You don't necessarily want the reverb tail, so you might want the reverb to shut up after a while and stop. And so that's basically Bright Ambience right there. But Bright Ambience, particularly when I was experimenting with it, like, it's possible to set it to this really long stretch, and that's cool. It's like this long, shimmery addition to the sound. But as I started fooling with it, especially when it resembled slapbacks, it really kind of struck me that particular technology is more useful as early reflections. And one of the things I have in one of my notepads there is I was listening to a really old YouTube talk by Casey of Bricasti. And Bricasti is known to be extraordinarily special reverbs. Like, you could buy a Bricasti reverb, but it'll cost you as much as a small car. And when you listen to them, you're like, yep, that's why it's worth as much as a small car, was because it's amazing. Part of that is not having ugly little interferences that you get from naive digital calculating. For instance, if you're doing this kind of thing and you have a naive digital calculator, you've got maybe some regenerating delays, and the whole idea is, it's a reverb, so it has to stretch out, so we got to have regenerating delays, right? And so you've got one there doing that, and you've got another one at a different spacing. Every time these spacings line up and duplicate themselves, no matter whether it's a all-pass or whether it's a comb filter, because this is a comb filter I'm showing is a regenerating echo, it is emphasizing sounds and producing, your comb filtering effects, reinforcing stuff. And not only that, it is not necessarily, like, in the real world, you got your sound here. Let's say that it is a nice sharp little corner. It is a high frequency sound where it's got like pointy edges to it. A little star. And that's your sound, right? if that sound is here, and it's bouncing around a room, let's say it's an idealized perfect room. So it's here, and then it's here, and it's here, and here, and here. And it gets to this point. A digital reverb will draw it like that, or draw it with quantizing artifacts that are just messing it up, right? Like wrong sounds in there. And the best you would hope for is less quantizing artifacts through having been recalculated this many times, but it's the same sound. In real life, you're going to have more like this. The sound passing through the air and bouncing off of stuff that many times will tend to soften. So this is one reason why digital reverbs tend to fail really hard at being convincing, is the sound of 1 second of delay through air is way different from the sound of digital delay at 1 second. Oh my God, I just realized that I can take this pen apart. Don't mind me. This is where they hide the extra styluses. Fair. I never noticed that before. Go figure. So, one of the things that's happening with bright ambience is, granted, we've got this box of reverb sounds, but there's no comb filtering inside it because it's all like spacings in prime numbers. All the little sounds inside this are spaced carefully so that nothing is actually being generated by regeneration. It's not attenuating. Bright Ambience 1 did that, but I think that it was a sidetrack. But it is producing these echoes, but the echoes are never producing comb filtering effects because they are individual discrete delay taps. And back in the day, that was really expensive on the CPU. It might still be. I mean, I've got it set up so that it's generating up to about 489 individual delay taps per sample. So you can crank up bright ambience to it to be pretty heavy, but the thing about it is it's producing this bright echo that is completely square rather than attenuating. But at the same time, the bright echo is not softening. You're starting out with your sharp sound, but you're ending with literally the same sharp sound, just without any comb filtering. And the real world would have it be a softer sound, because the high frequencies will wear off with seconds of transmission through air. Like if you have what's called an RT60, which is, I believe, the time that I want to say that the sound diminishes to half of what it previously was, but I could have that wrong. But RT60 is a measure of how long it takes for reverberation to die away. So if you got an RT60 of like 18 seconds, which is huge, by the time you're in the tail end of things, you have a extremely softened sound. Anytime you have a acoustic thing, I was watching a YouTube video a while back, and it was about a special mausoleum in Scotland where the acoustics of it happened to produce extraordinarily long reverb times, longer than most other places in the world. And although it wasn't great recordings, it was like cell phone style recordings, you still got to hear what was going on. And sure enough, as the reverb hangs out for, seconds at a time, it just goes super dark. Natural reverb goes really dark. And when you've got digital reverb that's implemented with comb filters and stuff, typically they still have stuff being really bright as it goes. So here's my idea. I'm going to try doing this, and once I'm finished talking about this, I'm going to switch off the green screen because it's amusing to me to be able to draw stuff on the screen. I hope it looks cool, but I also need to see chat, and I can't. What if you had this? You got your bright ambience right in the beginning. Delay it enough that you have enough delay time and consider it to be your short reflections. You could even do another layer of it, do another section of it where same, but in this case, I'm filling it in, run something like an average filter on it. So you got your full brightness echoes, which is like a glass room. That's the super near reflections. And then you got another little burst of that, which is intentionally softened. And after that, you've got MV. And MV is doing the all-pass filter thing where it's just generating a wash. The all-pass filters handled in that way are pretty good at generating like this diffuse space. And if you handle it properly, it also has that gatey effect where it'll build and then it'll stop. And that is somewhat unnatural, but there's a musical usefulness to it. And you can have that be as dark as you want. So it's basically like, treble, mid-range, and bass reverb sections. And here's the thing, is you can run these in these ways. The treble one is not going to make any comb filtering because it's bright ambience. Middle one could also be, it could be bright ambience or it could be the MV. But it's essentially slightly filtered. It's going to be softened a little bit. And then the low frequency stuff would be the slower MV algorithm, which is basically a Bloom algorithm. And by nature, that doesn't hit at first. It automatically builds and then subsides and then kind of cuts off completely. In fact, you could say that its shape is almost more like MV almost acts like that. It builds and then it shuts off, and it's this very blurry kind of sound. Whereas your bright ambience is going to be a much clearer and more pristine sound, but it'll cut out. So the idea is if you have stuff that overlaps in the right way, you'll produce a artificial reverb thing using different technologies for each part. The initial stuff can be early reflections handled in such a way that it magically doesn't ever comb filter anything. But you want that to shut up very quickly because it only works when it's floating around the immediate sound. There have been people who did reverbs where everything was meant to be full resolution and not decay in any way, and people generally found it horrible. I saw, in fact, governed some of my development because I saw the reaction to this. Somebody came up with a reverb plugin that was like, this is the ultimate optimum reverb because it is completely perfectly flat in every respect. And people were like, well, that's cool, but it sucks and I hate it. And it's like, oh, that's kind of harsh for somebody who's doing the experimenting, but it's also useful. And this is why. It's because we expect different tones at different stages of reverb. Like we expect this part to be like darker. And we expect this part to be slightly darkened. And then our very earliest reflections can be bright. And that's what we hear as plausible reverb, is the way that it dissipates and changes We don't want necessarily the reinforcements of comb filtering, even though that's what naive digital reverb always does. But we also don't want pristine ultimate resolution as things extend. So that's basically, I'm going to be trying to develop this and see where it comes from. And the neat thing about it is, it wouldn't really matter if other people saw me doing this video and went, oh, hey, I'll do that. Because the thing about it is, let me quit out of there. Boop. The neat thing about it, excuse me. Watch out, it turns out I have throat cancer, and it's like, oh, I have only 2 weeks to live. Coughing up pieces of lung. I did get really sick in the beginning of March, so maybe that comes back. But the thing about it is, it's not entirely just the technology of thinking of something like that to do. Instead, what you do is you come up with your technology for, this is how I do my early reflections, this is how spread out they should be, this is how long they should sustain, or how much pre-delay sits in here. This is where my mid-range stuff sits, and so on. And then you, and I might look into seeing whether I can run another instance of Bright Ambience 2 and soften it in some particularly useful way. What you do is you work out what roles these things are supposed to play. Like, good acoustic environments are good for a reason. You can get a lot of funny results out of things. Like when I was fooling with the Bright Ambience 2 and talking into it and using this microphone with it, one of the things I noted was that when I had it very close to the sound and very intense, I ended up getting a really powerful bass boost at one point, and I was like, huh. And I quickly changed away from that, but it gives you room, grounds for thought, like, well, what would happen if I designed a reverb around doing that, positioned those things that way, patted it down until it seemed like an appropriate level or whatever, and then used that to enhance fullness of whatever it was that I was using. Because it's like, it came off like this giant bass boost, right? But honestly, there could be uses for that. There could be situations where it's like, oh yeah, this is great on voiceovers, or this is great on this or that, the other thing, like this is great on acoustic guitar. Because it is filling in the detail. Let me quickly sketch out the... Quickly sketch out something that will tell me what I was talking about, because I'll need to pursue that. Knowing what to go for with that is extremely important. Like I'm having experience with the guy who's doing Airwindows for VCV Rack. We may or may not be departing over certain things, because he had somebody complain about his execution of monitoring, and he was doing monitoring correctly, and somebody went, oh, this is no good. Can you fix it? Because bass only is distorting when you give it stuff that is louder than minus 12 dB RMS. Which, it's like, yeah, don't do that. That's the thing. Monitoring is specifically for telling you, if you're doing that, your bass is far too loud. You need to back it down until it sits with the rest of the track. Now, if you're building a modular synthesizer in the virtual domain, it's very easy to have stuff going on that is like out of control. And so it's not surprising that people would have modular synthesizer stuff and be spitting out this output, but it defeats the purpose of monitoring if you take it and you rearrange it so that none of the sound effects sound bad. They're there for highlighting stuff that goes out of control. Like the fellow's other complaint was like, oh yeah, peaks only is distorting. Well, peaks only is designed to distort for when you do that. If peaks only is distorting, it's because you're pushing some kind of audio too hard, and to remove that would be to defeat the purpose of that part. So basically, I was like, well, you can do that, but then can I have a copy of the one that was done the way that I did it? Because that's what I need to use. That's what it's for. And by the same token, you could take the conglomeration of Bright Ambience 2 and MV and stuff and code a plugin that does all manner of things and literally do what I said earlier in this video, but still come up with something that sounds and acts completely different from what, for instance, I might do if I was to do a version of it. And if I say a version of it, it's not really about a version of it. It's more like, if this works, I can make multiple virtual spaces specifically designed to use things like Bright Ambience's capability of running at any sample rate without ever reinforcing comb filtering out of the actual sample rate itself. So it will be sort of interspersing things in such a way that whatever sample rate you're running at, it's still going to honor what the sample rate is and not produce effects that will interfere with that. So it will always be maximally bright ambience without... And the funny thing about it is it does produce its own kind of sort of tizzy sound, but at the same time it's a characteristic tizzy sound, but it doesn't interfere with other kinds. Like, if you have a color of tizzy sound in the raw audio, that should convey itself very accurately to the output. And it's kind of like that. It's like knowing the guts of how I would implement something like that. And I think the point that I wasn't really making often enough, reverb is typically done in such a way where you would by default go, okay, you hit the bright ambience, and then the bright ambience produces these early reflections, which you then feed to MV, which you then feed to the medium section and stuff. And all that's going to do is produce more comb filtering. Any coloration that you get out of the bright ambience or whatever is going to be conveyed to the subsequent things. And I just feel that that is a mistake. Although... And I don't remember exactly how I got this idea from the Casey video, because I don't think he's literally doing that, but, could be, for all I know. If so, then I've liberated it for the people, and now the open source people can try this as well. In fairness, I don't think he's ever talked about anything like that. It seems to me as if there is no reason that these stages of reverb should automatically feed into each other just because that's what reality does. Why shouldn't we have optimized reverb where the early reflection stuff is maximally clear and uncolored, and then the mid-range stuff in its own voicing is being fed by the raw signal as purely as possible, and then the deep reverb tails are also being fed by the raw input and not colored by the early reflection stuff or anything like that. That might just be ideal. We'll see. We'll see when I do it and then find out whether it really works or not. But it might be just the thing for getting really deep enveloping. Basically, I'm trying to compete with Bricasti with this kind of stuff, which is a very tall order. But why not? Might as well try. long as I'm still here doing this stuff, I will come up with these unreasonable things to attempt, and then I will attempt them and see how that goes. But in that context, you get into questions like, what is a sonic space and why, which is the name of what I was calling the stream. Why do you have certain kinds of sonic spaces? Well, one of the reasons I was demonstrating on vocals so much is because bright ambience is very well suited. I read a book of some kind, I think it was a book on Yes, in which they were talking about John Anderson doing his vocals for things like Close to the Edge, Tales of Topographic Oceans. They had a rough time with the Tales of Topographic Oceans recording, but as a side note, they were talking about trying to build up John Anderson's vocal booth and said, oh yeah, he needs specific things, this guy. He can sing, the roof off. He can sing a whole bunch, but he needs it to be right when he goes into it. So it's like, okay, there has to be the vibe. He needs some like nice candles or something there, a pretty environment, or at least something to focus on that seems inspiring, and a nice little sort of crystalline acoustic space that he can hear in his headphones. And I think that was the album where they tried to build his shower, because apparently he sang in the shower and found it inspiring. So it's like, I need to have that when I cut my tracks. I need to have the shower when I am recording my vocals so I can be inspired and I don't sound as good in this boring studio in front of this lame microphone as I do when I'm singing in the morning getting up and I'm in the shower. So I think they tried to build a shower stall for him and it didn't work. It was one of many things they tried on Tales from Topographic Oceans that they didn't actually work. But there is an interesting thing about the shower stall. Bright reflections. That said, the shower stall is also maximum comb filtering. You've got these closely spaced walls and the flutter echo, and in some ways it is the worst thing that you could do as far as getting your like nice, clean, illuminated, very close in reverb. But in some ways, it's nice, close in reverb with tile walls, so it's a very bright ambience. And that's what the Bright Ambience 2 plugin excels at, is setting up this environment where you can dial it back, you can pre-delay it a little bit, and then have this, again, the bright ambience coming in, but it doesn't comb filter. Instead, you stretch it out as long as you want it to stretch out using the extending thing, but it's still all prime numbers. Nothing is reinforcing, nothing is comb filtering. And then once you're finished with that, it doesn't continue to die away, it just stops. So you'd have a vocal booth out of the Bright Ambience 2 plugin that acts like that sort of shower stall with the bright reflections, but without any of the comb filtering problems. And that's why it was behaving well when I was vocalizing into it so much, is because it lends itself to that purpose. It is a idealized bright ambient environment without any of the comb filtering that you would otherwise get. And you get to have the close-in, really tight, bright acoustic space without the aggressive comb filtery obnoxiousness that you'd also have. But that is why people would seek a sound like that. I mean, if you haven't tried it, if you're not a vocalist and experimenting with that kind of stuff, I would recommend trying that plugin. But there's a reason that people go for that kind of thing. There is a feedback effect where you're hearing the sound that you just made coming into your ears, and it helps you sort of orient where your vocals are. But it also is filling acoustic space, so the sonic space, with the colorations and attitudes of your voice as you're making those sounds. And it's not simply a matter of making the correct note. it's also producing the correct sound for whatever vowel or consonant you're doing, and then it's coming back to you as feedback. But with that bright of an ambience, it's coming back to you with this very clear feedback. And if it's spaced out in that prime number way, it's coming back to you without comb filtery artifacts, making it sound more unpleasant, and that becomes a more inspiring singing environment. Now, whether the sort of midfield, whether the sustainy part of the reverb is going to continue to be appealing if it is based on a bright ambience, not necessarily. You might need it to sound a little farther away rather than continuing to hiss in your ears and be really bright as it sustains onwards. And that's when other kinds of sonic spaces come into play. Like the whole thing with the MV is that it can ramp up after an initial period of no sound, and then you can darken it. In fact, MV specifically has darken controls where it can progressively get darker and darker as you mess with it. Every little all-pass filter in the middle of it has its own capacity for doing an averaging thing. And you add enough of those up and your output's going to be really, really dark indeed. And that will be more persuasive as far as a midfield reverb. So basically, there are a number of things in factor here. And one of the key things, which influences in part why I haven't done this, you don't necessarily use one thing for everything. Like I saw on Facebook, people were continuing to ask me to do a version of Oak Sound Soothe, and I'm like, no. I don't do that for a reason. I think it's a bad thing to do. But you don't make a given sound be completely balanced in isolation and be everything. And you don't necessarily make a reverb or an acoustic space fulfill all purposes for everything. Like some of your voices might benefit from having a bright ambience to sort of fill out and color their sounds. Yeah, Sean Costello, a guy from Valhalla, is awesome. I said something about sounds, commented on Sean Costello, and everything went out of my head. This is what I do for a living. Well, actually, the reason I do this for a living is because I have so many damn things floating around in my head that's how that can happen, is that something got kicked loose. What I was talking about was the way in which vocals can benefit from a bright ambience that sort of fills in the atmosphere around you. You might have, say, a big guitar sound that's like, okay, this sounds like a giant ripping amplifier, or it could be a synthesizer that also sounds like a giant ripping amplifier, anything that does that purpose. And you're like, okay, this needs to be huge. It's got to sound like a hall or a stadium. How do you do that? Well, you have that initial sound, and it's going to probably be a little bit darker because it's probably not going to sound as close up as like a vocal. It's going to sound darker enough that it can be huge and sound kind of distant. But then, do you have the bright ambience filling in a blur around it? No, you don't necessarily have that. You have something more like MV, where for this sort of middle distance, super loud, gutsy sound like a guitar or a synth or something that's just ripping up the tone spectrum, it's typically going to be very mid-rangey as well. You have that. And then you have a more MV-like effect where you've got a degree of pre-delay. And then you've got the deep field reverb, which is going to be darker than that original sound was. And then it's going to extend. And the way that it extends is what tells you, oh, this is a super loud sound. See, it's activating the acoustic space. And we're getting a really long RT60. That must have been really loud in a big space because, hey, listen to that hall, listen to that stadium echo away boy, that must have been a loud sound. And that's what you do for things like, your guitar, guitar solos from Guitar Heroes or whatever, anything like that, where it's like, this is in the huge scale. This needs to be huge. You have it clearly heard, and then you have the more spaced out reverb cues that are telling the listener that was something that was super loud in a big space. Hear the way that the big space is echoing. And that's always going to be darker than like the crystalline little ambience that you put on a vocal to make it more glittery and glossy. And you don't necessarily have to have both of these things doing the same thing at once. I know it's typical to think in terms of like, how do I make the EQ for this thing so that everything has all of the best treble and all of the best bass and all of the best mid-range. You should be able to solo it and it sounds like a hit record all by itself. Well, no, that's never true, and you never want to do that. Instead, you're thinking in terms of a overall mix. The overall sound picture needs to have all of the elements doing the stuff that element needs to do maximally. So you could have a, say you're doing like U2 or something like that. So everything needs to be huge and as giant as possible. That doesn't necessarily mean you feed everything into the same reverb. What you might do is, so you've got your spectacular vocal that needs to be the most rock god ever. And they're singing into their little microphone or whatever. And so you throw a bright ambience on there enough to sort of sparkle up and intensify their performance. So any overtones in the guy's voice are going to be replicated and echoed around and produce that sort of pop hit gloss, like, and that doesn't continue onwards because you've got a guitar and the guitar needs to sound absolutely huge. So the guitar has maybe a slapback on it. And there's a degree of diffuseness to that, but that's mostly focusing on that. And you got your bass. Let's say the bass guy is like, I need to have reverb too. And that's a silly thing to put on bass. So maybe what you do is, knowing that you don't want the low end of the track to just be an entire pile of rumble, you give them their own little bright ambience, even though bright ambience focuses on highs, but that's going to give you the cues. It'll be maybe a little bit slower than the vocal ambience, and then it's still going to shut up once it's done. And it's going to be just enough blur that you can notice something happening on the bass. Like bright bass noises, there'll be like afterwards, cueing you into the fact that something's going on, but it's not filling up lots of lows by itself. And it's got that sort of gated behavior, so it's not going to continue pushing reverberating lows a lot. Then one of the secrets for drums is, you're doing your drums, you put reverb only on the snare, because that's what will tell people that the drums are in a big space. What you do then is you have your deepest reverb for the hugest elements in your amazing guitar solo and a touch of the vocal and whatever. And that's more like MV, and that's sitting way off there, and you don't make it be super duper loud. It's just there to sort of fill in what's going on. I'm going to need to come up with a better way of putting feedback on MV so that I can have a reverb tail that sounds and acts like one, but then actually delays. Maybe there'll be an MV2 coming along if I'm able to refine that. So what you wind up with your glorious, big, overwhelming, like U2 style rock mix is all these little artifacts, all these little effects isolated to what they're meant to do, and filling in the details that they need to fill in and staying away from some of the other details, like certain additional guitar parts or whatever aren't necessarily going to go into the big long reverb. Maybe that's just for the guitar solo, or whatever. And the pop star glitter on the lead vocal doesn't necessarily sit on all of the vocals or in all of the elements. It certainly doesn't sit on percussion parts, because the percussion parts might need to feel a little bit more gutsy rather than gated reverb 80s land. And yeah, if you had to find one reverb that would do all of those things for you, you'd be doomed before you even started. This is important. This is why I keep ranting against Soothe all the time. It's fine, but it's like, what I see people wanting out of it is like, what do I do in order to automatically put on all of my tracks and then everything will sound wonderful forever? And that's not how mixing works. It really is not. So it's much more interesting to approach stuff from how you're framing it and deal with the issues. This is also why I asked the fellow doing the rack windows to, not change monitoring. He could do that and call it something else. That'd be cool enough. But there are times when you need to not cheat, when you need to not weasel out of the thing that you're doing telling you, hey, you just did something wrong. If you have your vocal reverb, but it's the full band reverb, and so everything has to go through the same reverb that you've selected because it does the magic for the voice, and you're putting your percussion through it, and somebody's got like a cowbell, all of a sudden that becomes the most obtrusive thing in the world because it's a really sharp high frequency thing going on, and that's going to go into the reverb that works so well for the voice and produces this glitter on the voice where every little detail seems to be magnified and maximized. And then all of a sudden it is obnoxious on the cowbell because the cowbell is a background element that is orienting you around the timing of the percussion. And the percussive high frequency spike that it generates needs to not be blurred out in the same way. And it's all about determining stuff like that. It's all about doing things like, with the monitoring, for instance, being able to go and say, oh, I'm running this bass stuff into the thing, and now it's really overly loud and it's distorting. Maybe that means that this thing that I'm doing in the mix is pushing too much bass and I need to turn it down. Or not do as much of that. And rather than look for the answer, which is like, what do I need to do with this plugin to make it so that it's not distorting when I do this? The doctor says, don't do that, when you say, it hurts when I do this. And that's what I find as far as the distinction between being able to do really striking sounding mixes like people easily stumbled into back in the day versus like post-90s digital cheese where everything is extremely sculpted and extruded and people have these ideas of like, oh, you have to cut the hole in the bass in order to do this and then shape this EQ around the other thing and so on. And then they'll also have this notion that all the things need to be conclusive and really thorough and really deeply satisfying and cover everything from the word go, even in solo, which is not how it works at all. Let me have a look at the chat while we're at it. Andy's asking, any chance you're going to make a harmonizer vocal doubler with randomness and pitch timing and timbre? Not exactly. One of the things that I have sort of in the pipeline that I got to do is I need to put out the plugin glitch shifter. It'll be a re-release. It's not exactly like a new version, but that's an obscure little old plugin that is very funky in its way. It's a it is effectively like a harmonizer, except for that it's using a different algorithm to try to make it so that every sound it makes is much less blurred than you normally get, because normally you need to do a lot of interpolation. You need to do a lot of like granular synthesis in order to make a harmonizer work right. And I always found that to be very unnatural, so I wanted something that would be really visceral and direct sounding. And I made one, but it misbehaves real badly, which is why it's called Glitch Shifter. But it misbehaves badly while doing its pitch shifting thing, and you can also make feedback in it. So when it's misbehaving and glitching out while also feedbacking, oh, it's a mess. It's gloriously messy. So the harmonizer vocal doubler, you will be getting something like that before terribly long. But you don't necessarily have to like it, because the thing is, it's a monster. It is the old Glitch Shifter plugin, which I think you can still get in Audio Unit, but I'll be re-releasing that in a somewhat refurbished, but still basically the same deal kind of thing. And that is not actually randomness in pitch. It sticks with whatever pitch you told it to. Timbre gets weird and glitchy, and timing is especially randomized because it's trying very hard to just repitch the audio it's given and skipping around on zero crossings and points where everything matches. And so it gets really strange. But yeah, so that's the answer to that. Is I already made something like that. You don't necessarily like it. But if you do, you'll be very happy with it. An intelligent implementation of AT, MPV, bright ambience, and of course melt using something like Blue Cat Patchwork. Okay. Yeah. Lorenzo may have already left. Question, did I find something interesting with the Heritage Audio successor? Not really. No, it's a serviceable compressor. I'm not using it on my mix bus at the moment. Instead, I'm using it to amplify reverb stuff. And one thing I did stumble across is that since the way something like that works is like this. It's a diode-based compressor. So you have your diodes here that are cutting off sound, and the audio comes in here, and they manipulate how much it's cut off the sound by DC offsetting the entire thing, which logically means that since a waveform is going through that as well, it's going to have exactly the same behavior that you got in capacitor 2, which is striking nonlinearities that are all going to turn into even harmonics, like second harmonic and up. And that's probably why something like the successor or diode bridge compressors have the particular glue-like effects that they have, is because this is not a linear process. It's far from it. And that is something that I can experiment with. Probably what you'll end up seeing is a reissue of Pressure that uses that. And that will be the diode bridge compressor that people were clamoring for. Is not really a diode bridge compressor, but a instance of Pressure that's using this thing that I used on capacitor. I've got a number of things coming out that are based on that. So we'll see how that goes. But that's mostly what I found as far as that was concerned, is the fact that the diode bridge has even harmonic implications to how it works. Oh, Foco does use Glitch Shifter. Yeah. You could probably use that. Is Smart Reverb by Sonable really smart? I don't know. I have never tested it. A glitch amp. I haven't done the amps yet. Amps are coming along, but that's in the queue. That's in the stuff. Things like Bright Ambience 2 and the stuff that I'm doing with Capacitor 2 get in the way of me releasing the amps, because the thing about the amps is whether they are simple or more complicated, they will inevitably end up having to use some of these techniques. and I'll just have to see how that works. And it becomes interesting. Some of the work that I've been doing, it's taken additional hours of work just because I started using them and I would get weird effects. I have a variation on slew coming out. I'm very happy with what it does, and that means that it and the capacitor 2 discoveries get to go into a version of channel. And that's arguably more important than putting out old amp emulations. But if I can zero in on what the old amp emulations were doing, I can start bringing some of these new ideas into them. And that might get you closer to an actual amp plugin that wasn't absolute garbage. Because I'm very dissatisfied with digital amp plugins as a rule. I made some back in the day and I was so dissatisfied with them that I never went back to them or used them ever again. And I don't anticipate actually going to a place where it's like, I only want to use the digital plugin of amps, never mind any of this other stuff. I don't picture that ever happening for me. But I do understand that anything that I do can substitute for other people out there needing to have amps and preamps and mics and things. And that's important. So I do see the need. It's just that, as a guitar player myself, I like actual speakers and things so much, even though mine is in an ISO cab, but still. And that helps me put a higher standard on any plug-in amp work that I do actually do. So there's that. We shall see. We shall see how that develops. Stephen mentions Lexicon Hall reverb. Well, it's cool. I'm not likely to actually duplicate something like that, but the thing about that is, if I can put together some kind of funky hall-like thing that is based on like bright ambiances and MVs and stuff, I might be able to get into that zone. If I can get into that zone, that'll be pretty cool. And I wouldn't want it to be exactly the same, but I would want it to be equally desirable. And that's what I'm shooting for with that stuff. So Stephen is invoking the Simmons 80s drums. Well, bright ambience will probably get you some of the way there. But I've not actually made anything. That's not true. I've done stuff like that, but it never really worked. I would imagine if you really were into Simmons sounds, you want to be looking more in terms of samples rather than a plugin to turn something else into a Simmons style sound. But if you were trying to use a plugin to turn something into a Simmons style sound, you might actually get a lot of mileage out of what you do is you've got your sound. So let's say we're going for a tom or a snare or something like that. What you do is use bright ambience, but you don't set it up so that bright ambience is doing the full sustain of it. Instead, what you want is for the drum to be sustaining. You want the drum to rattle and continue, or the tom to continue to ring, and that needs to do your envelope because that will fade away. And then you throw bright ambience on there, very close in, and extend it out long enough so that you have this thickening effect that is going to magnify all of the brightness out of that, and that's going to give you the tone color that you want, but it will fade because the individual sound that you make, like the stick attack, that's only going to be ambientized very, very briefly. But then the remaining sound of the drum is also being ambientized as it goes. And it will fade away the way the drum does. Don't try to use the ambience to do the full decay of the drum. It will only do a gated snare kind of thing. But yeah. Peer Validated is asking about doing I Am Sitting in a Room. I know what that is. That's a very neat thing. I don't think I have anything ideally suited to that, at least not yet. One of the things I was being asked for a long time ago is grungy, deteriorated tape stuff, and everybody's forgotten about that I was going into it. One of the reasons is because another company came out and did a very funky, cool thing like that, and everybody was so excited about that I was kind of like, okay, cool, play with that. That seems fine. That wasn't the first thing on my mind anyhow, so that captured people's attention for a time. But yeah, if it was about doing something like that, it would be kind of like old versions of either 2-tape or iron oxide with a lot more warbling and degrading and stuff. And I've been specifically asked for exactly this, but that's what you'd need. You would need that for recreating the I am sitting in a room, and possibly like impulse responses. Thing though is I would always rather not do exactly impulse responses. Instead, you'd want to be doing something else. Bright ambience will get you some of that, by the way. You can use bright ambience in a way that's not super bright. What you do is a chain, say, that is like if you were using like Blue Cat's late replies, where you have a echo and you can put things in the regeneration chain of the echo, and even if they are plugins. So what you do is you'd set up a thing like that, or do a thing with like routing on your AUXs and stuff. You can do it in a submix. Do an echo to the submix and then feed it back. And then what you'd have is, say, maybe Avermatrix for dulling stuff out, because you'd want to cut the brightness a lot. And then bright ambience being used just as a non-color adding blurrer. And you'd already have taken away the highs. And maybe, like the tape effect or something with some flutter in there, because that will continue to regenerate as that goes. And the main thing would be to blur stuff out using bright ambience so that it turns into more of a wash. It's spreading things rather than just filtering them. You don't want to just only filter them. You also want to spread them. And the rest of it is just filtering it, because bright ambience all by itself doesn't darken anything at all. And so you would get none of the tone shaping that you'd wanted. Another possibility is bright ambience, and instead of worrying about like Avermatrix, you might use like a biquad and have I would use regular biquad rather than biquad 1/2, because interleaving isn't necessarily going to be your friend here. And set it to a bandpass so that it's killing the lowest, killing the highs. It will zero in on a honky mid-range kind of area, and that's how you would do that. So Ahmed is asking, why is it easy to make tape tube and emulations but hard to perfectly emulate an amp? It's not actually that easy to make tape tube and emulations either. But one of the things about a guitar amp is they're typically brightening devices. Like a guitar going into an amp and speaker and stuff, the speaker is going to darken things to some extent. But a lot of what gives an amplifier its life, like take some like classic Fender Twin or something, some classic old tube amplifier that people think is just all the mojo, and run the right Stratocaster into it and all that kind of stuff. Not so much heavy guitar, not so much, like Meshuggah doing really neat things with amp sims, because they need to just generate a lot of colored space. The really detailed, refined, spectacular guitar stuff is incredibly transient and incredibly bright. There's a lot going on there. And then the speaker is cutting, and the transformer in the amplifier, these things are cutting the super brightness, but there's still a lot of it there. Typically there's circuits, like my guitar circuit in my little amplifier, which is basically just a heavily hot-rodded Epiphone Valve Jr. So it's a $100 guitar amp. but it's got like groove tubes in it, and the capacitors are replaced with like $20 capacitors and a bunch of stuff like that. It's using a stage in the middle that I stole out of a Howard Dumble. And what that is a resistor between stages with a tiny capacitor jumpering it. And what that does is it's basically just a first order filter that is an additional brightening factor. And when you do that in analog on a tube amplifier, if it's behaving itself and not feeding back, because it can get ugly if the amplifier starts getting microphonic or feeding back or whatever. But do that kind of stuff right, and you start getting the guitar tones that are like, oh, wow, magic guitar tone. Wow, listen to the texture on that and the glitter and stuff. It's often just high-frequency boosting. A lot of that stuff is just made out of brightness and highs. And the amplifier, the speaker, is controlling that, but you're basically preamplifying highs incredibly much going into these distortion stages that then smoothly round it off. So you got like your spectacular guitar tone, it's the amazing Stratocaster through the vintage amplifier and whatever. And the inside of the amplifier is these relatively small capacitors. They're not passing through all the bass that you could get. If you replaced it all with like ultimate audiophile capacitors that give you the full range, the amp would lose its tone. Fairly often, you've got stuff like ceramic capacitors from amps made back in the day, and that'll have the same behavior, or could have the same behavior, that I was observing in capacitor 2. There's a even harmonic generation being produced in there. And the reason that this is problematic is that something like a tape emulation is very much about just the dulling aspects of things. You hit tape or whatever, and it's a very easily defined dulling effect that you have to get absolutely right, but you're not looking at quite the same thing as when the device in question is providing a massive high-frequency boost and then distorting it. That is a recipe for all of the aliasing in the world. It's a recipe for being in really big trouble, tone-wise. And it's very easy for your guitar amp sims in plugins to just be broken glass or dull and lifeless or any combination of those things. It's hard to get into that zone where it's like, oh yeah, I can feel the shimmer coming off of the strings. It feels alive. Because often that has a lot to do with high frequency boost. High frequency boost, and when you talk about tube amplifiers or even some of the transistor ones that are designed well, it's high frequency boost and a really mellow analog distortion that's not producing any aliasing, and it's not even producing any like grit or sharp corners in it. It's going to be a soft clip, but lots and lots of that soft clip. And that's why it's so challenging. It's been so challenging that I don't feel I've really succeeded with any of it. But I have some new tools to throw at it, so we'll see. So Andy talking about using the high cut. Funnily enough, the thing that I was talking about in my real amp is in the middle of the stage, literally a high pass. That's also what you get for a lot of, like your Tube Screamer is a high pass that's working in the deep bass. So it's conditioning the bass, which is why the plugin is called Guitar Conditioner. That could probably be improved with some of the stuff that I've learned as well. The Howard Dumble stuff, where you have like amazing Stratocaster sounds coming through these amazing amps, and some of that can be because the parts in the middle of the circuit are also functioning as high pass. the little old amplifiers like Champs and so on, if you've got a Fender Champ, that's a really primitive little circuit. And the speaker is like an 8-inch speaker. And the interesting thing about that is if you're doing, and I've done this with guitar plugins before, if you know you're going to distort the amp, and you also know that your speaker is only like an 8-inch speaker, it's not a full-size speaker, it's not a bass cab, it's an open back cabinet, you're never going to get low frequencies out of this thing anyway, so why try? What you'll see there is the amplifier's input stages have DC blocking capacitors that are a lot higher than they would otherwise be. Basically, the whole amplifier is a massive, massive high pass. It's the same deal with some of the like plug-in boxes and stuff, stomp boxes. Like I've got a Analog Mambino Boost, which is a very cool little stomp box. And it's also inspirational in that it's an incredibly simple circuit. That Beano Boost is basically nothing but a transistor and some resistors and a capacitor or two. They're not even on a circuit board. They're on a turret strip. They're on a thing you can bolt to the inside of the case, and it's just these little metal loops that you like hardwire the components onto using their own leads. There is no actual circuit board inside there. And essentially all a Beano Boost is a high-pass filter, because it's modeled after the Dallas Arbiter. I think it's Dallas Arbiter. The device that was used on a lot of things, including old Black Sabbath, is you got your Marshall stack, and then you got your sort of Dallas Arbiter treble booster thing. It's funny. It's kind of like these MIDI verbs where it's not even a normal type guitar pedal. Instead, it's this sort of thing that sits and looks like it's a box that sits in your desk or whatever. But that's the magic thing that was used for a lot of this stuff. And again, that is a treble booster. It's basically a high pass. The way that it works is it's a high pass at a certain frequency, and it'll attenuate stuff that's under it and also give a lot of gain boost. So across the board, you got lots of guitar stuff that gets the tones that we're familiar with wanting, and they're not high cuts, even if high cut will help you avoid getting aliasing. A lot of that stuff is high boosts, it's high passes, and that's how you're getting the exciting guitar sounds, is they tend to be very emphasized, and then we use the speaker to cut that down. If you put any of these guitar sounds through a hi-fi speaker, even if it was powerful enough to handle the wattage involved, it would sound horrific. There are amplifiers like the classic Fender Twin, where they are, first of all, very high-passy, but also have such sonority and clarity in their amplifiers, in the transformers. They're able to handle such high power. They're able to be so clean if needed, that even running through 12-inch speakers, they can still put an ice pick in your head and like knock your teeth out with treble alone. The fact that they're not able to produce supersonic frequencies, that they roll off at like 20K or whatever, they still barely roll off at 20K because they are so damn bright. So that's what you get, basically. With trying to do guitar stuff, you're basically trying to do incredibly brightened distortion, the worst possible scenario for digital modeling, and then smooth it out using like an impulse response or darken it in some way. And the trouble there is that if you've generated aliasing, then your darkening doesn't remove any of the aliasing. So there's your problem. There's the challenges. It's possible that what I'll end up having to do is using some of my usual techniques for the distortions and then just abandoning the idea that it's about running impulse responses and forcibly darkening what you produce. Instead, it might need to be guitar plugins that are more along the lines of clean sounds or whatever, does some of that stuff, and then tries to put out, like, maybe there will be bright ambience effects in there somehow. But stuff that just tries to produce the right voicing from the get-go and then not even running a speaker model. Because the speaker model won't take away aliasing. The speaker model will emphasize aliasing. If you've got like a Marshall cab model with a lot of low frequency whoomph and thump, then all of the aliasing in that range is only going to be emphasized. And there you go. So it's actually a big problem. It's much harder than the doing a tape effect or something like that. So yeah, and that's kind of exactly what I'm talking about, Bo. We're getting towards where I'm ready to head off and probably crash and take a nap. But as far a good Airwindows plugin to add clarity to a mix, you could try Energy. Generally trouble boosting and things. There's nothing really specific for that. It's partly you should mix to accomplish that in the first place. But yeah, as far as, don't forget that most guitar speakers have a real steep low pass cut in the upper mids. Well, the thing of it, listen to a Fender Twin. You'll be really shocked as to just how much super highs those 12-inch speakers can put out. Because the thing about it is they are not necessarily, this is one of the things I've learned in my experiments with guitar speakers and getting guitar sounds. It's not like a hi-fi 12-inch speaker at all. Woofers are designed to deaden the sound going into them so that they don't resonate, crackle, or emphasize things in any way. Guitar speakers tend to be a lot brighter, will tend to be flat-sided, kind of like a Yamaha NS10 speaker, which has its own qualities of that nature. So when you throw excessive highs into a guitar speaker, the cone crackles. It has the ripples of the high frequencies project outwards, and normally you would have a very small radiating area for a tweeter, but on the guitar speaker, you have a much larger area, none of which is really in phase with itself. So it'll act very weirdly, and yeah, the speaker cone will behave very differently depending upon what you play. It's super duper nonlinear, but a lot of that energy gets into the air. A lot of that energy gets through. So the roll-off that you speak of, it's like, well, it's kind of there, and then at the same time, it's kind of not. It probably will require me digging into some of the bright ambience ideas in order to make that work. I bet that would help, but it's going to require something like that rather than simply, because you can't take just the guitar spike of a transient coming off of the guitar and then reproduce that perfectly and have that come off as anything like a guitar amp. The sound of the amp is much more lively than that. There's a lot more going on, and of course in Airwindows land that means faking it, coming up with something. And the IR impulse response is going to be kind of dead, but also what you're going to get is typically they're kind of darkener. They're basically like a little convolution reverb impulse that is just a speaker. And it'll be kind of dead, but I think it's fairly often that people are using these plugins and things to generate a guitar sound that is very, very bright, and then using the IR to dull it. I don't think you're going to get many IRs that are like, yeah, this is a really bright IR and it's full of treble energy. It doesn't roll off anything at all. Instead, it's like the IR is specifically being used as a big old EQ. I'm not convinced that's how that should be done. But yeah, that's given me things to think about. I think I am getting to where I will say good night for the, well, good night, good afternoon for the day. I've gone longer than I said that I would. So let us put chat back. And I hope this has been helpful. It's been interesting. And I've certainly thrown around some ideas for what I'd like to do with the further reverb stuff. And we've got some things coming out as far as more analog-y style things. And honestly, I feel as if some of the talking that we're doing has brought me a little bit closer to the idea of getting amps together, to getting digital stuff. And it's not like I can't do that. Like I can plug a guitar or whatever into, my mic pre and get a perfectly decent direct guitar sound. So it's not like I'm limited in that factor. I can get as good a DI guitar sound probably as about anybody. It's just that I haven't really thought of what I would do to make that be exciting. And I think that's partly because I was still laboring under the misconception that I had to do it through typical methods and then use IRs very much to darken everything the heck down, which I no longer think is necessarily true. So we shall see. There's definitely some ideas that might be worth fooling with that could lead to what we're hoping to get. Anyways, that's the thought. So I will say good day to you for now. I'm going to do some form of Space House Jam tomorrow, starting at 11, same time as I started this, because that's what I do now. I went back to playing twice a week. If you like the idea of a house music combined with space kind of exploit that just starts and goes somewhere and you don't necessarily understand what it's doing, and then it takes you somewhere and leaves you, if that sounds fun, then by all means tune in. I'll be exploring those wild and crazy visuals, which I keep trying to make more interesting, and I've gotten them pretty far out by now. And I'll be doing it again on Thursday, and then we will have another plugin on Sunday, and we'll pursue that. So for now, I will say, talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.